She didn't flinch. Not when the Admiral asked the question. Not when the entire briefing room went silent. Not when every decorated officer in that room turned toward her, waiting for her answer. Lieutenant Commander Elise Rowan simply lifted her eyes, steady and calm, and said something that made even the toughest men in the U.S. Navy feel a chill crawl down their spines. Before we dive in, make sure you subscribe. Stories like this come every week, and you won't want to miss the next one. Elise had always been the kind of sailor people underestimated. She didn't look intimidating. She didn't brag. She didn't walk around reminding everyone of the classified missions she had survived. Most of her record wasn't even accessible to the officers seated around her that morning. All they knew was that she had been reassigned to a Special Operations Intelligence Unit after spending 6 months off the grid during a joint covert mission in the Pacific. Nothing else. No details. No reports. No explanations. Rumors swirled around her, whispers that she had been captured, or that she had taken out an insurgent group alone, or that she had turned on her own team in order to save them. But nobody really knew. Nobody except the Admiral, the only man in the room who had read her file cover to cover. So when he stood at the front of the briefing room that morning, cleared his throat and jokingly asked, "So, Lieutenant Commander, what's your kill count these days?" The room erupted in polite laughter. Everyone assumed it was an icebreaker, a joke, something light before the serious talk began. But Elise didn't laugh. Her jaw tightened just enough for the Admiral to notice. Then she slowly stood up, her uniform pressed sharp, her expression unreadable. She knew the Admiral wasn't trying to embarrass her, but he had touched a nerve that hadn't healed. The room felt quiet, a heavy, cold quiet. She took a breath. "Sir," she said, her voice firm but low, "I don't count numbers. I count the ones I couldn't save." That single sentence sucked the air out of the room. Officers who had seen battle, who had lost friends, who had buried memories deep enough to suffocate suddenly understood. Elise wasn't a myth. She wasn't a rumor. She was someone who had carried a burden heavier than medals and missions. The Admiral's smile faded. He hadn't expected that answer. And the truth was, none of them were ready to hear the real story. Elise hadn't planned to speak. She had sworn to stay silent, because the mission she had survived was the kind that changed people. But something about the Admiral's question, something about the room full of eager, curious faces, made her realize that silence wasn't strength, not anymore. So she told them. She told them about the night her team went dark, how a classified operation to extract 3 American hostages turned into a nightmare when their helicopter was shot down over open water, how half her team died on impact, how the survivors drifted for hours before washing up on an island controlled by a hostile militia. She told them about the men and women who fought beside her, hungry, injured, and exhausted, refusing to surrender even when escape seemed impossible, about how she took command after her lieutenant bled out in her arms, about how she scavenged parts from their destroyed equipment, built crude traps, and led her team through jungle terrain, crawling with armed patrols. She told them how she saved the hostages, carrying the youngest boy, barely 12 years old, on her back through knee-deep mud, while bullets tore through trees behind them, how she refused to leave one of her wounded sailors behind, even when he begged her to. And she told them the part none of them expected. She had taken lives, many, more than she could ever say out loud, but every time she pulled a trigger, she was thinking of the ones already lost, the ones she couldn't bring home, the ones whose families still believed they were alive. When she finished, the room was silent again. But this time, it wasn't discomfort. It was respect. Deep, humbled respect. The Admiral stepped forward, his expression softened. He looked at her not as a superior officer, but as someone who finally understood the weight she had carried alone. "Lieutenant Commander Rowan," he said quietly. You brought home more people than anyone thought possible. That's what counts. She didn't answer immediately. She simply nodded once and sat back down, as if she hadn't just rewritten the entire room's perception of her in a matter of minutes. But the Admiral wasn't done. He dismissed the room, keeping Elise behind. When the door closed, he leaned against the table and stared at her for a long moment. Elise, he said, dropping the formal tone, you're not here to be questioned. You're here because the Navy needs someone like you to train the next generation. They need someone who understands courage, mercy, and reality. She hadn't expected that. She had been prepared for debriefings, maybe reassignment, maybe even retirement. But training, leading, passing down the lessons she had bled to learn, it felt heavy, but it also felt right. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but certain. If they're willing to learn, she said, I'm willing to teach. Months later, recruits whispered her name like a legend. Some were afraid of her, others admired her, but every one of them learned something from her, something deeper than tactics, deeper than survival. They learned what the Navy truly stood for, not power, not numbers, but responsibility. And every time a new recruit tried to impress her with bravado or bragging, she simply gave them the same answer she gave the Admiral. I don't count kills, I count the ones I couldn't save. Those words stayed with them long after training ended. They were the kind of words that forged better sailors, better leaders, better humans. As for Elise, she never became the loudest voice in the Navy. She never chased glory. But she became something far more powerful, a reminder that the strongest people are often the ones carrying stories they never wanted to tell. If you felt something while hearing her story, tell me. From which part of the country are you watching this video?